Harper Whitmore had lived her entire life in Rockport, Massachusetts, a small coastal town with a scent of salt water drifted through open windows and the cries of seagulls blended with the slow rhythm of everyday life. At 67, she moved carefully through the world, shaped by years of routine, quiet mornings, and the lingering warmth of a long marriage. Her home on a quiet street near the harbor held memories in every corner: worn wood floors, framed photos of family gatherings, the soft hum of the old refrigerator, and the steady presence of her husband, George. But 5 years earlier, everything had changed in a single moment. It happened on an ordinary spring afternoon, the kind where the breeze carried the faint smell of lilacs and the sunlight warmed the kitchen tiles. Harper had gone into George's home office to dust the shelves, just as she did every Wednesday. She climbed the old wooden step ladder, its paint chipped, its joints loose with age, without thinking twice. She had used it 1,000 times before. When the ladder slipped, it happened so fast she didn't have time to catch herself. Her foot slid, her balance vanished, and suddenly the room spun. The right side of her head struck the sharp corner of George's solid oak desk with a sickening thud. Pain flashed white behind her eyes. Then darkness. When she opened them again, the room was still, but the world was different. Hollow, muted, distant. At first, she thought it was shock. A ringing filled her skull, then faded into a heavy, suffocating quiet. She tried to call out for George, but heard nothing, not even her own voice. She touched her ears. She tried again. Silence. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, though she couldn't hear them. Doctors came and went, their lips moving, their eyes full of concern. Tests were run, images reviewed, specialists consulted. Finally, Dr. Jonathan Reeves, the ENT who had cared for George for years, sat beside her bed. His expression carried the weight of a truth he didn't want to speak. George squeezed her hand, waiting for the words on the doctor's lips. When Dr. Reeves explained, slowly, gently, that the trauma from the fall had caused irreversible inner ear damage, Harper watched George's face crumble before she fully understood what it meant. The world would never sound the same again. Silence, once a peaceful companion, became an unbearable cage. She moved through days as though underwater, watching people speak, but catching none of their words, feeling the shift in their expressions, but never the tone behind them. Conversations became one-sided. Laughter happened far away. The isolation pressed against her chest until she feared she would forget what voices had ever sounded like. But George refused to let her drown in that silence. He adapted without hesitation, writing notes on yellow pads, tapping her shoulder gently before speaking so she could read his lips, sitting closer at the dinner table so she wouldn't struggle to see his face. When visitors came, he guided conversations, repeating things slowly with warm, patient eyes. He cooked for her when she felt overwhelmed, held her hand when she cried at night, and became her steady bridge to the world she could no longer fully hear. Even as his own health began to falter, his joints stiffening, his energy fading, George cared for her with unwavering devotion. His tenderness became her lifeline, her reminder that the world still held love even when it held no sound. But not everyone showed the same compassion. Her son Brian began visiting less often, always rushing, always distracted. Phone calls stopped. Holidays shortened. He seemed to withdraw from her, as though her silence made conversations too much work. And Sarah, his wife, never concealed her irritation. She sighed loudly when Harper missed something, rolled her eyes when Harper asked her to repeat a sentence, spoke to Brian across the room, assuming Harper couldn't sense her tone. Her coldness cut sharper than the fall that stole Harper's hearing. And slowly, painfully, Harper learned that sometimes the deepest silence wasn't caused by damaged ears, but by the people who chose not to speak with kindness. In the months that followed her fall, Harper began noticing details she had never paid attention to before. Small gestures, quick glances, moments that slipped through the cracks of routine. Her hearing was gone, but her awareness sharpened in ways she hadn't expected. Silence forced her to observe, and with observation came truths she wished she could unsee. Sarah's disdain appeared first in the smallest gestures. Whenever Harper asked her to repeat something, Sarah's jaw tightened just slightly, or she exhaled a long, irritated breath. She often turned toward Brian, speaking behind a half-covered mouth, assuming Harper wouldn't understand. And most of the time, Harper couldn't. But she could read faces. She could read tension. She could feel the heaviness of being tolerated rather than loved. One afternoon, Harper entered the kitchen to find Sarah standing near the stove, whispering to Brian while pointing a thumb in Harper's direction. Sarah's lips moved quickly, her expression tight, her eyes narrowed with frustration. Harper caught only 2 clear words from her lips. So useless. Harper froze for a moment before pretending she hadn't noticed. She slowly poured herself tea, keeping her gaze lowered as Sarah continued speaking in hushed tones. Brian glanced at his mother briefly, his eyes filled with something Harper couldn't name. Pity, guilt, or simply discomfort. But he didn't defend her. He said nothing at all. Later that evening, Harper sat at the dining table practicing lip reading with a small mirror. She traced the shapes of words with her mouth, practicing silent sentences under her breath. She needed to keep up, to stay connected to the world around her. But no amount of practice could soften the sting of realizing her own family didn't want to wait for her to catch up. She tried not to ask for help unless absolutely necessary. She tried to anticipate what others were saying before they finished speaking. She tried to move quietly, clean up after herself diligently, and be as unobtrusive as possible. Yet it seemed the more she tried to disappear, the more visible her silence became. The house itself felt heavier. Rooms she once loved now carried an undercurrent of unease. Brian and Sarah whispered in hallways, shutting doors more softly but more frequently. Conversations ended abruptly when Harper entered a room. Even footsteps felt different, hurried, irritated, or indifferent. The emotional temperature shifted, forming an invisible boundary she could feel but not cross. Only George remained untouched by this change. He still reached for her hand at the breakfast table. He still scribbled thoughtful notes on small pads of paper, his handwriting familiar and comforting. He made sure she sat beside him during family dinners, so she could read his lips clearly. When she struggled, he touched her wrist gently, grounding her. His presence softened the ache that crept into her heart each day. In the evenings, as the house quieted and shadows lengthened across the walls, George would sit with Harper on the couch. Sometimes he read aloud from a book, letting her watch the movement of his lips. Sometimes they simply sat together in shared stillness, a silence that felt warm rather than suffocating. With him, silence became something survivable. But even George's steady love couldn't shield her completely from the widening rift in the household. Harper sensed it growing like a crack beneath the surface, subtle at first, then unmistakable. She saw how Brian deferred to Sarah's opinions more each day. She saw how Sarah claimed small territories of the house, rearranging cupboards, criticizing Harper's routines, speaking to her with a fixed brightness that felt as sharp as glass. The warmth that once filled their home had thinned to a fragile thread. And Harper, sitting quietly in her own kitchen, realized that silence was no longer the only thing separating her from the people she loved. The emotional distance was louder than any sound she could no longer hear. It began so subtly that Harper thought she was imagining it. A faint click behind her right ear, a soft pulse of air that seemed to move through her like a distant heartbeat, a tremor beneath the silence. For years, the world had been sealed off, muted, unreachable, a closed door she no longer hoped would ever open. But one cold morning in early November, as she sat by the window folding laundry, something shifted. A thin, wavering sensation brushed against her awareness, like the quiet tap of a fingernail on glass. She lifted her head, holding her breath. Another flicker, a vibration, a whisper of something that felt like sound, but wasn't quite there. Later that afternoon, she told George through their shared notebook. His eyes widened, and for the first time in a long while, hope lit his features. The next day, he drove her to see Dr. Jonathan Reeves, the Yenti specialist who had treated her after the fall. Harper watched the doctor as he examined her, his brow knit with concentration. When he finally pulled off his magnifying headset, his expression was careful, measured. He began explaining, slowly, clearly, about a new experimental procedure. It wasn't a full cochlear implant, but a targeted surgical intervention aimed at stimulating the partially damaged auditory nerve. There were no guarantees, no promises, success rate low, risks present. George listened, squeezing Harper's hand. When Dr. Reeves stepped out for a moment, George turned to her, his voice steady, his lips forming words she could read with ease. "What do we have to lose?" She searched his face. He wasn't being naive, he was being brave for her, the kind of bravery she had relied on more times than she could count. And so they agreed. The procedure took several hours. Harper drifted in and out of sedation, the world around her a blur of masked faces and bright overhead lights. When she finally woke, George was sitting beside her, his eyes soft, his hand wrapped around hers as though anchoring her back to life. Recovery was slow. Some days she felt nothing at all. Other days, faint vibrations responded to loud noises or sudden movements. Weeks passed with unpredictable flashes, sometimes a thin whistle, other times a distant hum. Then one morning, as she was pouring tea, she heard something unmistakable, the soft clink of the ceramic lid against the pot. She gasped, nearly dropping the teapot. For the first time since her fall, a real sound had pushed through the silence. She didn't tell Brian. She didn't tell Sarah. She told only George. That evening, she sat beside him in the dim light of their bedroom as he wrote in his familiar, careful script. "Don't reveal it yet." He paused, then added beneath it, "Listen. See who they really are when they think you can't hear." Harper looked up at him, stunned by the gravity in his expression. There was sadness there, but also certainty. As if he had already seen cracks she had only begun to notice. She nodded slowly, understanding more than he said aloud. 3 weeks later, George died quietly in his sleep. There was no warning, no final conversation, no chance to prepare herself. She found him in the early hours of the morning, lying peacefully, his face relaxed as though he had drifted into a gentle dream. The grief hit her like a wave, suffocating and relentless, tearing through the fragile stability she had been clinging to. The house felt unbearably silent without him, not because she couldn't hear, but because he had been the only voice she still understood. His final message stayed burned in her mind. Listen, watch, wait. And in the echo of that quiet directive, Harper felt the first stirrings of a different kind of awareness, one that would soon change everything. The morning of George's funeral arrived gray and cold, the kind of November day where the sky hung low and every breath felt heavy. Harper moved through it like a ghost, guided more by muscle memory than intention. Brian held her elbow as they walked toward the small white chapel, though she could feel his touch was more obligatory than tender. Sarah walked ahead of them, already speaking in hushed tones to someone on her phone, her expression composed, almost businesslike. Inside, the chapel was filled with neighbors, old friends from Rockport, and former customers who had known George from his years running the local hardware store. Soft organ, music played as people took their seats. Harper sat between Brian and Sarah, her posture straight, her face calm, her eyes lowered every bit the grieving widow who could no longer hear the world around her. She kept the act intact, just as George had advised. Mourners spoke quietly nearby, their voices carrying threads of memories Harper felt rather than heard until recently. He always knew exactly what tool you needed. He never let anyone leave his shop feeling lost. He helped me fix my porch for free. Wouldn't take a dime. Every recollection carved a deeper ache into her chest. George had been good. He had been steady. And now he was gone. When the priest began the service, Harper folded her hands tightly, pretending to follow the shape of the ceremony without catching the words. But she heard everything. Every prayer, every sigh, every shuffle of feet on the wooden floor. And then voices behind her whispered, too close to be anything else. She didn't turn. She didn't even blink. She recognized Sarah's voice instantly, light, cold, edged with impatience. Sarah was speaking to her friend Emily Grant, who leaned in close. The two of them hidden behind Harper's back as if her silence made her invisible. Thank God this is over. The words were soft but clear. Harper's breath caught in her throat. Emily murmured something back, too quiet to make out. Sarah continued, her tone clipped. Brian didn't know what to do with her. She can't live alone. Harper felt her heart drop like a stone. We'll sell the house and put her in assisted living. It's time. Emily's slight gasp told Harper the friend was surprised. Even she hadn't expected such bluntness. That place near Danvers is perfect, Sarah added. Safe, clean. And she won't wander around at night. Harper kept her gaze fixed on the front of the chapel, her face unmoving. She forced her breathing to remain steady, forced her shoulders not to tighten, forced her eyes not to fill. But inside her, something cracked, quietly, deeply. George hadn't even been gone 24 hours, and Sarah was already planning her removal. Not care, not support, removal. Brian said nothing. Harper could feel the stillness beside her, a silence that sounded like agreement. The priest's voice rose again, calling for prayer, and the chapel bowed their heads. Harper bowed hers too, hiding her trembling chin. Her fingers pressed tightly together to keep them from shaking. She understood, now, why George had warned her, why he had told her to listen, why he had wanted her to see the truth for herself. And there, in the middle of his funeral, Harper realized they hadn't just buried her husband. They had buried the last person who had truly been on her side. The house felt different when they returned from the funeral. Quieter in a way that wasn't about grief, but about intrusion. Harper stepped inside first, pausing in the entryway. It was still her home, yet the atmosphere felt altered, as though someone else had already started rearranging the air. Sarah walked in behind her with the confidence of someone unlocking her own front door. She moved through the hallway briskly, flicking on lights, straightening a frame, gathering mail off the console table. Harper watched her with a sinking feeling in her stomach. It wasn't imagination. Sarah carried herself like the new mistress of the house. Brian helped hang Harper's coat, then drifted toward the kitchen without saying much, shoulders slumped, eyes distant. Harper followed slowly, slipping into the familiar rhythm of her rooms, pretending to be swallowed by her grief while keeping her ears open. In the kitchen, Sarah was already on the phone. Her tone was calm, calculated, professional. Hi, yes, this is Sarah Whitmore, my mother-in-law's caretaker now. Harper froze just outside the doorway. Yes, she's been struggling. Mentally, emotionally, honestly, she's declining pretty quickly after losing her hearing, and now George. She's disoriented, confused. We're worried about her safety. Harper's grip tightened around the back of a dining chair. A pause. Sarah listened. No, she definitely can't manage the house. Bills pile up. She forgets things. She doesn't understand paperwork. We found unopened letters everywhere. Harper's jaw clenched. It was a lie, every part of it. Sarah didn't know she could hear every word. And with her hearing almost completely gone, Sarah continued, we think she needs a formal assessment. Guardianship, maybe. We want to do things properly. Guardianship. The word struck Harper with chilling clarity. Another pause. Yes, of course we understand the procedure. Someone will need to be appointed to make financial decisions on her behalf. Yes, her son, most likely. Brian Whitmore. Harper swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. Guardianship meant control. Control meant power. Power meant they could sell the house the second the ink dried. Sarah ended the call and immediately started another one, this time to a medical office. Hi, Dr. Franklin. Yes, this is Sarah. I spoke with your assistant. We need someone to come evaluate my mother-in-law. She's withdrawn, confused. She wanders the house at night. And after the surgery years ago, her hearing deteriorated even more. I'm afraid she might hurt herself. Another lie, a devastating one. The worst part was how easily the words slid out of Sarah's mouth, as if she were reciting something rehearsed. Harper felt her throat tightening. She backed away from the doorway, gripping the wall to steady herself. Every sentence had carved a deeper cut, revealing not apathy but intention. A plan, a strategy. She moved quietly through the living room, staring at the familiar furniture, the photos on the walls, the blanket draped over the couch. Everything George had built, everything he had protected, suddenly felt fragile under the weight of Sarah's ambition. Later that night, Harper overheard Brian and Sarah talking in their bedroom. Brian's voice was uneasy. I don't know if this is right, Sarah. It's necessary, she replied sharply. You heard the doctor. She needs supervision. Besides, your dad knew she couldn't live alone. We're doing what's best. A long silence, then Brian's reluctant sigh. Okay, if you think it's what we have to do. Harper felt her chest tighten. Her son, her only child, was choosing compliance over courage. And then, like a soft whisper from the past, she remembered. George, the hallway closet, the heavy coats pushed aside, the small hidden safe built into the wall, and the sealed envelope he had shown her, his expression somber, his voice firm, a safeguard, a last protection, sensing danger long before she did. Now she understood why. The next morning, Harper woke before dawn. The house was still, the kind of stillness that followed grief, but also something darker. Anticipation, calculation, a quiet tension that didn't belong to her. She sat up slowly, listening to the faint creaks of settling wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Sarah and Brian were still asleep. This was her moment. She slipped on her robe and moved down the hallway she had walked thousands of times. Every photograph she passed, birthday snapshots, vacation moments, an old picture of George holding a fishing rod, felt like a silent witness urging her forward. When she reached the hall closet, she paused. Even unopened, it felt alive with memory. She pushed the door open. The smell of cedar and old wool rising up like a forgotten season. Heavy winter coats sagged on the bar. George's thick charcoal parka. Her own worn beige coat with a frayed pocket. Scarves bundled on the shelf above. Harper pushed them aside. Her hands found the hidden safe recessed into the wall, exactly where George had shown her months earlier. She remembered that day now with almost painful clarity, his face pale from illness, his voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. If anything ever happens, you'll need this. At the time, she had thought it was unnecessary worry. Now she understood it was foresight. The combination spun under her fingertips. Their wedding date. A soft click answered. Inside lay documents, neatly arranged. Birth certificates, insurance forms, old letters, and on top of everything, a sealed envelope with her name written in George's unmistakable handwriting. Harper's breath caught. She slid the envelope out and opened it with trembling fingers. There, folded carefully, was George's real will. She recognized the official stamps, the signatures, the notarized seal. But it was the words, clear, firm, written long before his health declined, that made her chest tighten. He left everything to her. The house, the savings, the accounts, every asset, and beneath the list of property, he had written a statement so explicit it felt like a hand gripping hers from beyond the grave. Despite her hearing impairment, my wife, Harper Whitmore, remains fully competent, capable of independent decision-making, and in sound mental condition. Any attempt to declare her incapacitated or limit her rights should be considered a violation of my wishes. Harper closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, her spine straightened, her shoulders gently lifted, and a warmth spread through her chest. Not relief, not triumph, strength. George had known. He had seen the cracks forming before she did. He had protected her the way he always had. Quietly, thoughtfully, thoroughly. She pressed the papers against her chest, letting the truth settle inside her like a returning heartbeat. This house was hers. Her life was hers. Her voice, silent for years, was finally stirring again. But she also knew this wasn't something she could confront recklessly. Not with Sarah already weaving lies. Not with Brian torn and easily swayed. Harper tucked the will back into a folder and placed everything carefully into her bag. When she closed the safe, the latch gave a small, decisive click, like the closing of a chapter she had never meant to read but needed to understand. She stepped out of the closet, the early morning light stretching across the floor like a quiet promise. George had given her protection. Now she needed a plan, a careful one, a patient one, a plan worthy of the man who had trusted her with the truth. The psychiatrist arrived 2 days later on a cold, bright morning. Harper noticed the car pulling into the driveway from her seat by the living room window. A modest silver sedan, no flashy decals, no nurse's badge, just a quiet, professional presence. When the doorbell rang, Sarah all but sprinted to answer it. "Dr. Chin, thank you so much for coming," Sarah said with the warm, sugary tone she reserved for outsiders. "We're really worried about my mother-in-law. Losing her hearing, losing George. It's been overwhelming. She's confused, withdrawn. We just don't know how to care for her anymore." Harper watched from her armchair, unmoving, her expression carefully distant. Dr. Maya Chen, a calm woman in her late 30s with dark hair pulled into a neat bun, stepped inside and surveyed the room with practiced eyes. She had the posture of someone who paid attention, to details, to silences, to the things others hoped she wouldn't notice. "I'd like a few minutes alone with Harper, Dar," Chin said gently. Sarah blinked. The smile faltered. "Oh, well, I think it's best if I stay," she insisted. "She gets anxious around strangers, and she can't hear very well. So she might misunderstand. I work with patients with hearing impairments every day," Dr. Chin replied, still soft but firm. "It's important I speak with her privately." The doctor's calm authority left little room for argument. Sarah hesitated, jaw tightening, but after a moment she forced a plastic smile and stepped out into the hallway. Harper heard the faint click of her heels as she lingered just beyond the door. Dr. Chin took a seat across from Harper. For a moment, neither spoke. The doctor simply observed her quietly, her gaze gentle, reassuring. Then, with deliberate slowness, she pulled out her phone, opened a blank note, and turned the screen toward Harper. Large, clear text appeared. "Do you understand me?" Harper nodded once. Dr. Chin typed again. "Do you know where you are?" Another nod. Then the doctor paused before writing the next line. "Do you want your daughter-in-law in this room?" Harper shook her head immediately. A shadow of understanding passed through Dr. Chen's eyes. The next question came carefully, each word precise. "Are you afraid of her?" Harper held the doctor's gaze. She swallowed, and then nodded. Dr. Chin exhaled quietly, her expression softening. She typed again, slower this time. "Are you pretending to be more fragile than you are to understand what's happening. Harper didn't look away, didn't hesitate. She nodded again, firmly. Dr. Chun set the phone down for a moment, folding her hands in her lap in a gesture that felt almost protective. Then she wrote the words that made Harper's breath hitch. You are not alone. You have rights. I will help. Harper felt something warm rise in her chest, a small but unmistakable spark of hope. After days of listening to lies, of hearing her life discussed like a problem to be managed, here was someone who saw her, who believed her, who recognized the truth she could only reveal in silence. Dr. Chin stood to leave, offering Harper a reassuring nod before stepping into the hallway. Harper could hear Sarah pounce immediately with anxious questions, but Dr. Chen's voice remained calm, unreadable, professional. Harper sat quietly in her chair, her hand steady for the first time in days. She finally had an ally. The next morning, the house felt eerily calm. Sarah had left early for yoga class, her gym bag slung over her shoulder like she already owned every room she walked through. Brian was at work. Only the ticking kitchen clock and the soft rustle of the curtains reminded Harper she wasn't dreaming. It was time. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, her steps steady, her face composed. First, she retrieved the folder she kept hidden behind the winter coats, a folder that held George's real will, notarized and sealed long before illness dimmed his strength. She placed it gently into her bag. Next came the audio recordings. Small, unassuming files stored on a digital recorder. Every whisper, every lie, every casual cruelty Sarah had allowed herself to voice, believing Harper lived in silence. Harper checked each file, watching the timestamps flash on the screen, then tucked the recorder safely away. She had hidden the recorder beneath the living room side table, nestled between old books and unused coasters, right where Sarah often passed by while on the phone. The mic had picked up every word with chilling clarity. She added the medical documents Dr. Chun had provided, clear evidence that Harper was mentally competent, stable, and capable of independent decision-making. And last, she pulled out George's final letter. The paper was creased from being opened so many times. His handwriting was steady, firm, unmistakably his. She held it for a moment, letting his words strengthen her the way they always had. Then she slipped it into the folder. By the time she zipped her bag closed, her breathing had settled into something calmer, something anchored. She straightened her coat, smoothed her hair, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. She called a taxi. The driver took her downtown to a modest brick building with a weathered sign, Arkwright and Hollis, attorneys at law, a place she and George had trusted for decades. Inside, Thomas Arkwright, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and steady as bedrock, looked up from his desk as Harper entered his office. At first, he gave her the soft, polite smile one reserves for a grieving widow. Then she spoke. Her real voice, unused for years, cracked slightly at the first word. Thomas, I can hear, and I need your help. Thomas froze. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. Harper, he said slowly as though testing reality. You here? She nodded, and then she told him everything. She spoke with the patience of someone who had been silent too long. She told him about the surgery, about George's warning, about the funeral whispers, Sarah's phone calls, the lies stacking up like bricks in a wall they were building around her. She placed the recorder on his desk. She laid out the medical documents. She unfolded George's will, letting the official seal catch the light. Thomas listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening, his expression shifting from shock to outrage to a calm, cold determination. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhaled through his nose, and spoke with the clarity of someone preparing for battle. Here's what we're going to do. He held up a finger. First, we'll get a completely independent psychiatric evaluation to confirm your competency. Dr. Chen's assessment is excellent, but the court will respect an independent third-party evaluation even more. A second finger. Second, I will personally serve Brian and Sarah a 30-day eviction notice. They have no rental agreement, no legal right to occupy your home. They leave peacefully, or the sheriff removes them. A third finger. And third, if they attempt anything, guardianship fraud, financial coercion, medical manipulation, falsifying reports, you will file charges. You have more than enough evidence to pursue a criminal case. Harper felt a warmth spread through her chest, steady, rooted, unmistakably her own strength returning. Thomas gave her a reassuring look over his glasses. You're not alone in this, Harper. Not anymore. She breathed in deeply, feeling something inside her settle into place, like the first click of a lock turning the right direction. George had protected her. Now it was her turn to protect herself. Harper returned home that afternoon with a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. She unlocked the front door, stepped into the quiet entryway, and slipped seamlessly back into her role. Her final day of pretending. She moved slowly, deliberately, letting her body appear smaller, her attention unfocused, her hearing gone. Sarah was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables with the brisk efficiency of someone who believed the house already belonged to her. She didn't notice Harper step in, or didn't care. Her voice floated through the doorway, casual, confident, as she chatted with someone on speakerphone. Yes, the assessment went well, Sarah said. She barely understood a thing. Honestly, we're almost there. Once the paperwork is filed, everything will finally be in order. Harper's stomach tightened, but her face remained blank. She went to her chair in the living room, opened a magazine, and pretended to stare at a page without reading. Sarah walked past her a few minutes later without a glance, humming under her breath, the picture of satisfaction. But Harper knew the truth. By tonight, everything would change. The hours passed slowly. The light through the windows turned gold, then dimmed. At 6:15, the front door opened. Brian stepped inside, shoulders hunched from work, dropping his keys onto the console table like he always did. Hey, Sarah, he called. Smells good. Then he turned toward the living room and froze. Harper was standing, not hunched, not small, not silent. She looked at him with a clarity that stopped him mid-step. Brian, she said, her voice calm and unmistakably steady. We need to talk. Brian's face drained of color. Sarah stepped into the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. What's going on? But she stopped when she heard Harper's voice. Her jaw dropped. The towel slipped from her fingers. What did you just say? Sarah whispered. Harper didn't repeat herself. She walked to the dining table, opened her bag, and placed the digital recorder on the polished wood. Then she pressed play. Sarah's voice filled the room instantly. Thank God this is over. She can't live alone. We'll sell the house and put her in assisted living. Once she's declared incompetent, we can handle everything. Brian staggered back a step, turning pale. Sarah lunged forward. Stop that, Harper, stop. That's taken out of context. Harper raised her hand, silencing her. She reached into her bag again and placed George's real will on the table. Official stamps, signatures, notarized seal, glinting under the overhead light. Brian stared at it as though it were something radioactive. Sarah's face contorted. That can't be real. This is manipulation. You're confused. You don't understand legal documents. I understand enough, Harper said quietly. And I heard every single word you said about me. Brian closed his eyes, chest heaving. Sarah tried again, desperation creeping into her voice. You're being tricked. Someone forged that will, or you misunderstood what the doctor said. Sarah, Harper replied, her tone sharp enough to cut the air. I am done listening to your lies. She took a steady breath. You have 1 hour to pack your things and leave my home. If you're still here after that, I will call the police. And I will file charges. Sarah blanched. You can't. You wouldn't. I would, Harper said. And I will. Brian rubbed his face with both hands. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. Sarah said it was best, and You chose silence, Harper said quietly. That was your choice. Brian opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. His gaze dropped to the will on the table, then to the recorder, then to his mother's eyes, clear, wounded, unwavering. Shame hit him like a wave. He broke then, shoulders shaking. Eyes wet. I'll help us pack, he whispered to Sarah without looking at her. We're leaving. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. Brian. No. But he was already walking toward the hallway. Within minutes, their bedroom doors were swinging open. Drawers pulled out, suitcases thumping against the floor. Sarah moved frantically, muttering under her breath, eyes wild with anger and fear. At the 40-minute mark, they carried their bags to the car. Brian paused at the doorway, looking back at Harper with shame carved into his features. I'm sorry, Mom, he said softly. Harper didn't answer, but she didn't look away. They drove off into the dark, and the house finally was hers again. The next morning, the house felt different, lighter, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. Harper stood in the doorway of the living room and slowly looked around. For the first time in months, she didn't feel watched. She didn't feel spoken over. She didn't feel erased. She began reclaiming the space, quietly, methodically. She removed the throw pillows Sarah had insisted on buying, the ones in colors Harper hated. She stripped the guest bed where Sarah and Brian had slept, washing every sheet, every pillowcase, until the fabric smelled like her own lavender detergent instead of Sarah's sharp citrus cleaner. She took down the dry erase calendar Sarah had stuck to the fridge, covered in reminders Sarah believed she needed. Piece by piece, she took her home back. In the afternoon, Dr. Maya Chin called. Harper? Just checking in. How are you holding up? Harper smiled, an honest one. I'm not pretending anymore, she said. And I'm not afraid. A warm satisfaction softened Dr. Chen's voice. I'm glad. You did everything right, and you weren't alone. Harper thanked her, sincerely, knowing those few words of solidarity had changed everything. A week later, she did something she hadn't done in years. She called her older sister, Caroline Hayes, who lived in Bar Harbor, Maine. They hadn't been close recently, not because of distance, but because Harper had quietly slipped into isolation, too consumed by George's illness and her own silence to reach out. Caroline answered on the second ring. Harper? Oh my goodness, sweetheart, are you okay? Within minutes, Harper had booked a bus ticket. Caroline welcomed her with a warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket. The salty breeze from Frenchman Bay filled the little cottage. They walked along the shore, ate clam chowder at Caroline's favorite cafe, and spent long evenings talking, really talking about childhood, about love, about loss, about surviving things that should have broken them. Harper felt the grief inside her loosen, just a little. When she returned to Rockport, she didn't shrink into solitude. She joined the local library, attended a weekly knitting circle, and visited a community group for seniors that met at the old town hall. She found people who listened, people who laughed, people who cared in simple, genuine ways. One afternoon, a letter arrived in Brian's handwriting. No return address. She read it at the kitchen table. Brian wrote about shame, about weakness, about letting Sarah make decisions he should have questioned. He wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, only hoped that someday she might let him earn back a small place in her life. Harper folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. She would not forget, but she could choose how to move forward, and she made it clear in her reply. Trust was not something that reappeared overnight. Sarah never contacted her, not once. Eventually, Harper heard from neighbors that she had left Rockport entirely. Peace settled deeper into Harper's home. On a warm spring morning, Harper installed a small brass plaque beside her front door, polished until it gleamed. The home of Harper Whitmore. Enter only with a clean heart. Weeks later, the local library invited her to speak at a gathering for women her age. She stood at the front of the cozy reading room, surrounded by faces lined with life. "I spent 5 years in silence," she told them, "but in that quiet, I learned who truly stood beside me, and I learned to listen, not just with my ears, but with my life." Some nodded, some wiped their eyes. Afterward, Harper walked home in the late afternoon sunlight, feeling the gentle hum of the town around her. That night, she sat by her living room window with a cup of tea, the air cool and peaceful. She listened to the soft rustle of leaves, the creak of old floorboards, the distant call of a night bird. She heard everything, fully, clearly, beautifully, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence inside her was completely, wonderfully gone.